Welcome back. In this video, we'll set up our game with our UI assets inside Unity. If you want to make your own UI for the game, you should have it ready for this video. If not, go ahead and finish making your assets and jump back here whenever you're ready. This is the Unity editor. The editor is separated into different windows. Let's go over the default windows and each of their functions. The hierarchy window is where the scene lives. This is also where all the game objects in our game exist. If we want to add a 3D model or UI to our game, first we create a game object for our asset to live on. Game objects don't implicitly have any function, but are given function by adding components to them. We can see a game object's components by clicking on it and heading over to the inspector window. Right now we only have our camera. So let's click on the main camera and see what we have. In the inspector window, we can see a bunch of different properties, and it can seem daunting, but if we collapse the drop-downs, you can see that we only have 3 components on our camera: transform, camera, and audio listener. The top has the name of the game object, which you can change without it having any effect on any functionality. The check next to the name is the enable checkbox. When we uncheck this box, it turns off all the functionality of the game object. This can be great if you want to remove something from the scene without deleting it so you can add it back later. Static is if something is static. Tags and layers are used for programming, but we're not using them in this series, so we're not going to dive too deep into them. However, they're both heavily used when programming, so it's good to know that they're there. If we open up our components one at a time, it can be a lot less scary to look at. Let's start with the transform component. The transform component is special because this is the only component that every single game object has to have. Because of that, whenever we create a new game object, it will automatically have a transform component attached to it. It positions the game object in 3D space inside the scene. Of course, we're making a 2D game, so we don't need all 3 dimensions, but it still offers that to us. The camera component in our main camera game object is the component that gives the game object the functionality of the camera. You can see it has a lot of properties, but we're not going to adjust anything, so we can leave this alone. The last thing is the audio listener component. As you can see, this one doesn't have a drop-down because there are no properties on it that we need to adjust. However, this is important because without this, the player won't be able to hear any audio we might add to the game. If we right-click on it and click Remove Component, no matter how much sound we put into the game, we won't be able to hear anything. The main camera game object comes with an audio listener, so you don't usually have to worry about adding it to a component. And you only ever need one audio listener in your game for sound to be picked up. To add back in the components, we can click on the Add Component button, and you can either search for it in the search bar, or go through the menu to find the component you're looking for. Components are the brain of Unity, so it's essential to understand that game objects just hold components, and the components themselves are the things that make Unity and your game function. In the middle of our screen, we have the scene window and our game window. The scene window is for us to move things and manipulate them. The game window is what the player sees when they play the game. You can see that in our scene window, we have a lot more going on because we want the ability to see things that are invisible. In this case, we just have a camera, but you can also imagine why this would be important if you have the sound of a flame, a light emitter, or even a trigger for an event. The player doesn't need or want to see these things, but it's vital for us as game developers to be able to manipulate them. At the bottom, we have our project window. This is like an internal file explorer for Unity. This is where we will hold all of the assets we made and will make. The console is a really helpful area that will tell us if we have any errors or warn us of potential problems. It's also a great place to test our code without creating the full functionality. You're going to be using the console a lot during your time coding, but in this video we won't be touching it. Let's get into building our game's UI now that we have a better understanding of how the Unity editor works. Drag in your assets from your file explorer to the project window. I'll be using the Hacker UI assets I created, but if you're using a different design I made, the process will be exactly the same. If you made your own, you might have to do some adjusting, but as long as you made all the assets I mentioned in the first video, you shouldn't have too much trouble. Before we start adding our assets to the scene, let's organize our assets. Make a folder by right-clicking in the project window, hover over Create, and click Folder. We can name this folder Images and drag our hacker screen, cursor, and option folder into the folder we just created. Let's start putting our sprites into our game. If you're not familiar with that term, a sprite is a game development term that basically just means image. You'll hear a lot of people use them interchangeably, and the difference between a sprite and an image is very minor. In order to put our sprites into the game, we need to create a canvas. A canvas is a game object that will render the UI for us. Render just means to make something visible. Unlike 3D models or terrain, UI elements cannot be rendered in our game without living on a canvas. Canvases require a few different components in order to function. Luckily for us, Unity has created a bunch of pre-made game objects with pre-selected components to make our job easier. So in order to create a canvas for our sprites, right-click in the hierarchy window, hover over UI, and select Canvas. If we click on our canvas, you'll see all the components that Unity set up for us: the Rect Transform, Canvas, Canvas Scaler, and Graphics Raycaster. To center the canvas game object in our scene view, you can double-click on the canvas in the hierarchy window. When we added our canvas, Unity also automatically added an event system. We don't have to change anything here, but just know that the event system is the thing that makes our UI interactable. Without the event system, our UI wouldn't react to any player input. So later on down the line, if you're working on a game and the UI doesn't seem to be functioning, make sure that you have an event system in your scene. Okay, let's go back to our canvas and adjust our canvas scaler. The canvas scaler is a thing that changes the canvas scale when the screen size changes. Constant pixel size just means the canvas will not change even if the player changes their window size. We want our canvas to grow and shrink with our player's window, so let's change this to scale with screen size. The reference resolution is a default size that our game wants to be at. It will shrink or grow if it's smaller or larger than this size. 1080p is the standard resolution of most modern desktop screens, so let's change it to 1920 on the X and 1080 on the Y. We'll also want to change the match all the way to height. This sets it so that our height or Y value will be locked at 1080 and the width will adjust depending on the screen size. You can mess with this if you want to see the differences, but I tend to default to these settings whenever I'm working on a desktop game. For our UI assets to appear, they have to be nested within a canvas game object. This is called parenting. That's not a joke, by the way, that's actually what it's called. To parent a game object, we just right-click on the game object, and for our case, we're going to add a panel, so go to UI and click on Panel. The panel stretches out to the parent scale, which in this case is the canvas, and that's exactly what we want for our background. If we put our game window and scene window side by side, you'll see that we can adjust the windows by clicking and dragging on the border. You can see that this changes the aspect ratio of our game, and we don't want that. To fix our aspect ratio and resolution, go to the game window and click on the free aspect dropdown. I'll select 1080p because that's the resolution we set in our canvas scaler, but you can also set it to 16:9, which is the same aspect ratio as 1080p. Great, now that we have that set up, let's actually change this white box into our game background. Click on the panel in the hierarchy and you'll see all our components in the inspector. We want to change our source image in the image component to our game background. So let's drag our game background into the source image field, which should update automatically. But as you can see, it looks faded. The reason for that is because the panel defaults to a little less than 50% transparency in the color. To change this, click on the color at the bottom. The A channel or alpha channel is set to 100 out of 255. All you have to do is drag it all the way to 255 and the image should be crystal clear. Alpha controls the image's transparency. The more alpha we have, the more opaque the image will be. Great, now we have that set, let's add our buttons. Right-click on the canvas game object, hover over UI, and click on Button Text Mesh Pro. You should get the TMP importer window pop up. Go ahead and click on Import TMP Essentials, and it will start adding in all the files needed to make Text Mesh Pro work. Text Mesh Pro is like an extension to Unity that allows us to manipulate text to a much greater degree. Unity had its own text system, but now Text Mesh Pro is the standard. Once it's done, you can click out the window and everything should be functioning. Right now, the button doesn't look the way we want it to look, but changing this is really quick and easy. First, let's go inside our option folder in our project window so we can be ready to start plugging things into our components. Click on the button game object in the hierarchy panel and head over to the inspector. The two components we need to adjust at the moment are the image component and the button component. Let's drag our unselected image from our project window into the source image field in our inspector window. We're setting this to unselected because our button's default state will be unselected. You'll notice that the button is still really small. To adjust it to the size we created, click on the Set Native Size button in the image component, and it should scale up to the size of the image. Let's move to our button component now and change the transition from color tint to sprite swap. Color tint is an option to change the color whenever you interact with the button. We already created the different sprites for each state, so we can switch between the different sprites when we switch to each state. Drag the corresponding image from our project panel into the button components. You'll notice I didn't create a selected sprite. That's because once a button is selected, it will immediately reset and move on to the next story block. So you can just set this to highlighted. Now, in order to test our game, we can run it right inside our Unity editor. To do that is really simple. You just click on the top play button, and now if you hover over the buttons and click, everything should be working. Once you're done testing, make sure to click out of play mode by clicking on the play button again. It's really important to remember that any changes you make during play mode do not save once you exit play mode. So make sure that you're not in play mode when you're changing things if you want to keep those changes. Now, if we go back to our hierarchy panel and click on the drop down for a button, you'll see that the button also has a child. And this is an example of a game object being a parent and a child at the same time. In our text TMP game object, let's check out its components. The one that we're interested in are the Text Mesh Pro Text UI component and the Rect transform. In our Text Mesh Pro component, you'll see a lot of familiar looking icons if you ever worked in a design software or even a word processor like Google Docs or Microsoft Word. This is how we manipulate the text to change it to look the way we want it to look. Let's change the color so we can see what we're doing. Let's change it to white by clicking and dragging all the way to the top left of the color picker. Let's also change the font size to 32 so it's easier to read, and we can also set it to bold as well. Now, I actually designed the background to seem like it's giving off a slight green light, so I want to change the text color to the same green as the button. Unity has this feature that allows you to choose any color in the scene using a tool called an eyedropper. Let's zoom into the green bar in our scene window using the scroll wheel on our mouse and click on the eyedropper tool next to the color and select the green color by clicking on it. Now the text should update to be that same green color. I also want to align the text to the left, so let's go to the alignment and click on the left align button. As I mentioned before, these alignment tools work the same as other word processing applications. We put the text left aligned, but we don't want it too close to the green bar because then it'll overlap. To fix that, in our Rect transform component, let's add padding to the left side of our text. Padding is just a term for empty space within an element. I'm going to add 48 to the left, which should look good. I also tend to add the same amount of padding on opposite sides, so I'm going to add 48 on the right, but this isn't necessary. Excellent. We have one button done. Now let's move on to adding in our story text. To add the text without the button, right-click on the canvas, go to UI, and select Text Mesh Pro. Now it's going to pop up in the middle of our scene. To move the story text, make sure you select it in the hierarchy panel and click W on the keyboard. The transform arrow should pop up and we can move it wherever we want on the screen. But there's a better way if we press T on our keyboard. And if you forget the shortcuts, you can just come here to the left side and select the tool you want. With the Rect tool, we can grab the blue circles and scale it. To scale on all sides simultaneously, just hold down the Alt key on your keyboard. The Rect tool also enables snapping so we can position it directly in the middle of the scene. You can adjust it to wherever you like best. I like to keep all the text aligned on the left side, so that's what I'm trying to line up here. This project is small, so it's not incredibly important to keep things organized, but it's a good habit to build up. So let's keep our hierarchy panel organized as well. Let's change the name of the text TMP game object to story text. Button seems appropriate for the button, so we can leave that, but let's change our panel game object's name to background image. As I mentioned before, this doesn't change any functionality, but in the future, when you have a million different game objects in your scene, it's a good habit to name everything appropriately. Cool, we're almost done. Let's move on to making the rest of the buttons. Now, with our buttons, we can just duplicate the button we already have, but if we wanted to make changes, we would have to change every single button individually. Or we can make a prefab. A prefab is like a template of a game object, and it adds some nice features like quickly applying changes to all instances of the prefab. Making a prefab is super simple. Just drag the game object you want to make a prefab of into the project window. That's it. We're all set with the prefab, and it even switches out the game object we had in the scene with the prefab. Now we can duplicate the button as a prefab, and if we make a change to it, we can apply the changes to all of them with just a couple clicks. We can move these into place as well, but if you see, the distance between them is not the same. We can use a component to automatically take care of spacing. So let's delete all the button prefabs and create a new empty game object inside our canvas. To make an empty game object, right click on the canvas and click Create Empty. Let's change the name of this game object to Buttons Container because this container will hold all of our buttons. And we want to add a new component to this. It's going to be a layout component. So let's go to layout. We want a vertical layout group because we want our buttons to be laid out vertically. Let's drag in our button prefab into the buttons container game object so we can see what we're doing when we start adjusting the vertical layout group component's properties. Let's duplicate it 4 times or however many options you have in your game. And as we add them in, you'll see that the button container is automatically spacing out our buttons according to the spacing in the inspector. But we don't want our buttons to start at the center of the screen. We want the center of our buttons to be at the center. So to change that, let's change the child alignment to middle center. Let's also change the spacing between our buttons so the player doesn't accidentally hit the wrong button on accident. I think 16 is a good space between them, and now if we want to move the buttons up and down, we can just move the buttons container and it will move all the buttons with us. Okay, here's a small challenge. I want you to change the color of our story text to the same color as our button text. Hopefully this isn't too difficult, but if you're having trouble, you can rewind the video to when I change the button text color. Great, one last thing. If we take a look at the design I showed in the first video, you can see that that has a different font. But if we look at our Text Mesh Pro component, the only option that we have is Liberation. To add more font options, we actually have to download our own fonts online. There's a great site called The Font. It's a great resource for getting new fonts for your games or whatever use you want to use it for. You can see on the right side of these fonts, some have a piece of information saying how you can use it. Some say free for personal use, others say 100% free, and others don't have anything. If you want to release your game, you have to use one that is 100% free, or pay for a font that has that license. So browse around for a font that you like. I already found my font. It's called Commodore 64 Pixelated if you want to use the same font I used. Download your font and unzip the folder. The only file we need is the TIFF file. So let's drag our TIFF file into our project window. If you try to use the font right away by dragging it into the Text Mesh Pro font asset field, you'll see that Unity doesn't let you. We have to convert this TIFF file into a file that the Text Mesh Pro component will understand. So let's go to the top of our screen and click on Window, and you should find Text Mesh Pro near the middle of the dropdown. There, click on Font Asset Creator. It should pop up a new window. We don't have to adjust any of these properties, so let's just drag our TIFF file into the source font file field. Then click Generate Font Atlas. It should be a relatively quick process to generate it. All we have to do is save our file, and now we have a font asset file that our Text Mesh Pro component will accept. Let's add our new font asset to our story text Mesh Pro component. And now is the perfect time to show the benefit of making our buttons into prefabs. If you see in our hierarchy window, there is a tiny arrow on all our prefabs. If we click on that arrow, it will take us to our prefab editor. Any changes that we make while we're in this prefab edit mode will be reflected to all of our prefabs. So let's drag in our new font asset into the font asset field, and it should change all of our buttons automatically. We can go back to our main scene by clicking on this little back arrow in our hierarchy window. Now, you don't have to follow along with this part, but let me just show you what would happen if you made a change outside of the prefab editor. I'm going to change it back to the old font, and if I drag it into just the first button outside of prefab editor mode, you'll see that it doesn't change the rest of the buttons. But you will see that there is now a small blue dash next to the button prefab, letting us know that this button prefab is not the same as the rest. It contains an override from the default prefab. And in our inspector window, you will actually see a new prefab section at the top. If you click on the overrides dropdown, this will show you all the differences from the default prefab. It will even show you how to get to the differences or override. For us right now, the only thing that is different is inside our Text Mesh Pro component in the TMP game object. So if we go inside our text game object, you can even see what is being overridden by the small blue dash. If we go back to the button parent and click on overrides again at the bottom, you can even revert your override, which would turn your prefab into the default prefab you created. Or you can apply the override for the rest of the buttons. For us, we want all of our buttons to have the new font, so I'm going to click apply all. And you can see that it will apply the changes to all of our buttons. Great, we went over a lot in this video, but hopefully going through and adding our UI to the game has helped solidify the concepts in your mind. And even better, we have everything set for the next video when we're actually going to start programming. Exciting, but before I leave, I just want to do a few organizational stuff. First, I'm going to make a new folder called Prefabs and drop our button prefab into it. And then I'm going to drag our TIFF file and font asset file into the font folder inside of our Text Mesh Pro folder. And lastly, naming stuff is important, but we still have our scene named sample scene. So let's go into our scenes folder and change that by clicking on it and pressing F2, or you can right click on it and rename. And let's change this to main level. It'll ask you to reload. Just go ahead and click OK, and we're all set for the next video. I'll catch you over there.